Beijing has warned that it will take countermeasures if the U.S. goes ahead with its decision to impose that as new tariffs on Chinese goods. A foreign ministry spokeswoman says China does not want a trade war, but it's not afraid of fighting one. Now, earlier, the Chinese foreign minister also criticized Washington, that is. Wang Yi said tariffs are not a constructive way to solve the trade dispute. On Thursday, U.S. President Donald Trump promised to put additional tariffs on $300 billion of Chinese imports from September the 1st. He made the announcement the day after the latest trade talks ended with no deal in sight. The world's two largest economies have been at loggerheads over trade issues since last year. We're going to be discussing these issues, recent one between China and the U.S. with guests who joined this panel. Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos, publisher and editor with Politics First London, is joining us via Skype from that city. Later on in the program, if we have the chance, we're going to have Mr. Greg Simons, author and researcher, who's going to join us from Uppsala, I believe. But first, I'll begin with London and Mr. Papadopoulos. Thank you very much for joining this broadcast, sir. Tell me, what do you think about this? You know, first of all, the reasons why, after so many negotiations and talks, you know, nothing seems to be getting out of these negotiations in order to stop the tariffs from going into force, which I believe is going to be in 29 days, according to the U.S.
Well, with the new tariffs that Donald Trump has imposed on Chinese goods, this has now taken the trade war between America and China into a new stage. And the question is, where does this end? Because America and China have imposed tariffs on billions of dollars worth of goods, which is affecting businesses and consumers in both countries. So where does this all end? It is certainly not conducive to either the American or the Chinese economy for this trade war to be long term. So how can it be resolved? The question is very difficult to answer because, of course, responding to Mr. Trump's new tariffs, the Chinese president has said that China will take reciprocal measures. So I suppose if I try to answer my question, there are really two options. If Mr. Trump fails to be re-elected as president in 2 years' time, then there is an opportunity that this trade war will be brought to an end by his successor. But nonetheless, that election is not for another 2 years. And in business, a week can be an extremely long time, a long period of time for a business, and can have damaging effects. So 2 years really is not good for either the American or the Chinese economy in the context of this trade war. Or Mr. Trump relents, his advisors around him, not the neocon advisors, but the economic advisors who will say to him, whilst we understand the tariffs you're placing on Chinese goods, the American economy depends to a very large extent on its trade relationship and its investment relationship with China. So we cannot afford for this trade war to continue indefinitely.
Okay, let's bring in Mr. Greg Simons from Uppsala. He's an author and researcher. Thank you very much for joining this broadcast, sir. Also, I'd like to get your opinion about this whole thing. You know, first of all, I'm very curious about your opinion and your interpretation as to what stage of the talks and negotiations do you think we are witnessing at this point?
Well, I mean, you're hearing a lot of noise from Trump, but this is much greater than Trump. Because if we remember back some years, Obama was the president who had the Asia pivot. The main stake here is that the US wants to retain its global hegemony, which is based on its economic and military power. So we're looking at the economic power. And there is the estimate that the US has something like 5 to 10 years to keep their hegemony before China takes over. So, I mean, whether Trump is there or not after the next election, this issue will continue so long as China is perceived as challenging the US hegemony.
Okay, let me put the same question to Mr. Papadopoulos about the stage in the talks as we speak. You know, by that, of course, Mr. Papadopoulos, I mean, do you think, you know, the way the communication between the two countries are going, you know, the result of the negotiations, the whole outlook of the matter, the stage, do you think is a hopeful one, is a good one, is a positive one? Are we moving in the right direction? Or perhaps, you know, come September, do you think that we're in for actually bigger shocks for perhaps both China and the US and the rest of the world?
Well, first of all, allow me to say that I agree with the other guests that should Donald Trump fail to be re-elected in 2 years' time, the trade war between America and China will not come to an end overnight. But what I believe will happen is that the trade war will become less and less intense, and there will be a greater opportunity for Washington and Beijing to resolve the matter. Now, as to the current situation between Washington and Beijing, as I said moments ago, it is not in the interests of either party for this trade war to continue. But I am somewhat optimistic that it will be resolved. Now, why do I say that? Because the American and Chinese economies are interlocked. If, for example, China was to go into recession overnight, then that would have a grave impact on the American economy, and vice versa. If the American economy went into recession overnight, that would have grave consequences for the Chinese economy. And that is another demonstration as to why many commentators in the world are wrong when they say that China and Russia will come together to take on America and bankrupt America. That is absolute nonsense. It is not in the interests of the Chinese economy for the American economy to falter. So based on that, America and China have to resolve this, because both the American and Chinese economy need each other desperately.
Okay, and then let's discuss the fight back power of China, as they say. Mr. Simons, they're not looking for a trade war of any sort, but they're not afraid of fighting one. How do you think they're going to respond, and how strong do you think the Chinese response will be?
I think your other guest sums it up quite well. Objectively, both parties are intertwined, and this trade war is good for neither. But mankind, especially in the 21st century, really works on objectivity rather than subjectivity. So what you have is this desire to keep down this competition. And China will respond. And I think what you also see, the unrest in Hong Kong, is also tied somewhat to these attempts, and what you see in the South China Sea. So, in Trump's particular negotiating style, he's back on this apprentice, which he was, where he tries to negotiate a hard deal. Now, with the Chinese, this will not work, because the Chinese are long-term thinkers and planners. They work strategically. And so they will do what they say. If we remember back to the Kosovo War, and the Americans shot a missile into the embassy, well, it was some years, but that spy plane American spy plane was brought down over Hainan. So there will be consequences, and whether it is in 1 year, 10 years, or even longer, the Chinese will keep to their word.
Thank you very much to both of you, gentlemen. We're just running out of time for this interview. I had the pleasure of speaking to Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos. He is a publisher and editor with Politics First out of London. Also, Mr. Greg Simons, was with us. He's an author and researcher who joined us via Skype out of Uppsala. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with this broadcast. And thank you, viewers, for watching this broadcast.